Welcome to another episode of the Plutus Awards podcast. Our community is filled with hundreds of stories from creators and entrepreneurs just like you. And through this show, we share these stories of challenges and successes from bloggers to podcasters, from writers, speakers, and more. I'm your host, Michelle Jackson. Today's guest is Amanda Page, former personal finance blogger, current documentarian, and nonprofit founder. In this episode, we talk about how fear and perfectionism can keep creators from taking risks and developing projects that feel out of reach for them. In Amanda's case, she ended up filming a documentary with no experience. She shares how taking this one bold risk has changed her outlook on putting herself and her creative work out into the world.
I'm Amanda Page. I'm a writer, editor, and filmmaker now. I've been a personal finance blogger in the past. I've also been a professor in an academic setting. Now I'm a writer, editor, and filmmaker, and doing some consulting work on the side as well, doing a lot of grant writing to fund my own projects. And I also am the executive director of a nonprofit I founded.
I have so many questions, but I reached out to you because of a tweet that you shared recently. In that tweet, you talked about doing, is it called DoorDash? Is this what we call it? Okay. In having these conversations about like the deadly sins that we as content creators can inadvertently sometimes commit with our businesses, I think one of them as content creators is not being candid about cash flow and money and like the tension around money in our businesses. And I wanted you to share, one, how you transitioned from you were a professor, you were pursuing these creative pursuits, if you will, in your own business, and then becoming your own business. And then those moments when you have to DoorDash. So if you could kind of talk about the genesis of all this, that would be great. You can be as long-winded or brief as you would like.
I think with DoorDash, I want to just start with the balance of time where you're trying to create and, make your work. And sometimes I exhaust myself between coffees I'm having for networking reasons and relationship building. Also trying to write a grant or get an article done. Because there's so many pieces, it's not necessarily like I've overworked myself, but I've definitely gotten myself into a place where I'm just tired and I'm not going to have time to meal prep. And everything in my freezer is disgusting by the time I get to it. It's like, I don't want any of this. So I DoorDash. It's like a little treat I give to myself. And I'll tell you, I only do it when I'm feeling particularly flush. Like I know I can cover it. I've got some cash coming in. I know I can pay off this card quickly. It's definitely not something I build in or budget for, but it's something that I treat myself with when I know I can cover it because I work really hard. And from going from like professor to creator of these projects, that's really, especially, I have a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And then moving into academia, that was the whole point of putting creative writers in academia, was to give them time and space to create. So that was always kind of the model that I was familiar with. It works to a point, but I also want to say that it's really interesting too, when you're attached to a university, I think people make assumptions that you have like a lot of resources at your disposal because you have the institution behind your name. And that's not always true. You have to kind of find a way to build your own resources. I started doing that I had created a nonprofit. I incorporated a nonprofit during the pandemic. It was an idea I'd been kicking around for a decade or more, 2 decades. And I incorporated it during the pandemic. And our first project was a documentary. And like all of that had nothing to do with my academic work. It was all done through my nonprofit. All the grants I wrote were through that nonprofit. It was a very separate thing. So I had my full-time job money, and I was writing grants to fund the project. It did feel a little bit like extra income, but we all know how quickly extra income becomes debt payoff money or emergency fund money or paying your DoorDash off money. So
I have a question about what it looked like to transition from leaving academia to going into, you are your boss and you are running your business and you have to sustain everything. Like, what was that transition like? I don't think you were adjunct, which is a whole different conversation. Yeah. So if you could talk about that transition and making sure that you're getting paid, that would be really helpful.
I will say this. I have been an adjunct professor before, and I won't do it again just because it's so exploitative. I've never understood why that's where we decide to cut corners in higher ed. I mean, no one goes to college to be administrated to. So I'm not really sure why it works that way, but I have been an adjunct professor in the past. I won't do it again. But during my years as a full-time professor, really working on my mindset and what I think my expertise is worth, that has been maybe the hardest part of the transition is just, I don't want to call it imposter syndrome, but really because the academic job market is crap. And if you happen to luck into a position, that's amazing. And yes, you deserve it, but it's also like, there's so much involved, right? About the politics behind it. So I think it was great for me to have the position for as long as I did, but moving out of it, it was a really long process and just really thinking about where I wanted to direct my energy, what projects really had my attention. I could tell there was like a kind of a split happening anyway. Like I still really love teaching, but it was time finally for me to do some of my creative projects that had been on the back burner for years. And a lot of it was they'd been on the back burner because I was chasing financial stability after having been an adjunct and, letting myself take some roles that were more exploitative. So during my time as a professor, I really did create like a really solid financial foundation. And now I feel like from there, I can go after my projects. I've got like a robust emergency fund. I do have more systems in place to do my grant writing and to acquire projects and that sort of thing. I want to say that. And I also want to say that back to the mindset piece, like I really think it's taken a while for me to believe in what I say, like really build my voice and my unique point of view that I am really trying to show through my projects.
I want to talk about how you paid for your documentary and like what it looked like to fund that and what it's like to have a grant heavy monetization focus. I think there are a lot of content creators who way underestimate the amount of money that they could probably have access to if they said yes to grants and it just added that as part of their monetization as a revenue stream. So could you kind of talk about what that's been like for you and your brand?
100% grant heavy monetization is not ideal because you need grant match. You need money to match the grant a lot of times. If you build in grants to your budget and then when you don't get it, how do you make up that missing money? Grant heavy is not ideal, but I do really believe in the power of grants, especially creating foundation. And from the beginning, I mean, one of the things that really worked for me was getting a couple Ohio Humanities grants right off the bat, because it kind of legitimized my organization because it was brand new and no one had heard of us. And now it was like the Ohio Humanities backed side of literary. It gave the project some weight too and status. So, I mean, grants for a lot of reasons are helpful, but that was really one for my organization and the documentary that made a lot of sense. All in all, for the documentary, it's so funny. I had never intended to be a filmmaker. And then during the pandemic, when we were in lockdown, someone on Twitter mentioned this documentary Moundsville, about Moundsville, West Virginia. I've spent a lot of time in West Virginia, and I
love that documentary.
Yeah, I love movies about places. So I watched it. I ended up talking about it on Twitter, made friends with the guys who made it, and then partnered with one of them. I was like, now let's do it for Portsmouth. And the story idea came to me immediately. It's like, I don't want to say I'm a failed essayist, but I have failed at writing some of these essays about different parts of my hometown for years. And this is how it manifested. It manifested, instead of being an essay, it became a documentary. And I think that's important too. Like I really believe that sometimes if something isn't working, whether you're trying to do a podcast, if you're trying to do a film, an essay, if something is not working, it might be a different form. Yeah.
I hadn't really even thought about that. I didn't know that this had a different life, like this concept had a different life. You're not wrong that I think sometimes people forget that we're in a creative space. Like if you're content creating, it's a creative work. You can't always force it.
Yeah. So the film is about, it's about Portsmouth, Ohio, but explores the history of the city through the history of three of its city slogans over the last 100 years, 200 years, 100 years, since the early 1900s, 100 years. Uh, and why I really focused on city slogans is because when I was 16, I became aware of the Where Southern Hospitality Begins city slogan, which is painted on the flood wall. It's on the official city letterhead. And it stuck with me in weird ways. Like I weirdly internalized it. And I went to graduate school in Alabama to kind of figure out like, what is this Southern hospitality thing? I was interested in regional culture. I didn't have the vocabulary to say that at the time, but I carried around this, like, why do I care so much about this Where Southern Hospitality Begins thing? What does it say about my hometown? It's kind of a loaded phrase. Plus we're in Ohio. How are we the South? I mean, I had tried for years to write an essay about it. And then it just, after Moundsville, after watching that film, it just clicked. And the other great thing, just to talk about the money a little bit more, the great thing about Moundsville is they made it for like almost nothing. That was a labor of love. So when it came time to write the grant budget, I was like, what do I ask for? David Bernabo, my co-director, who is the co-director of Moundsville, he gave me like, here's the equipment. Here's how much it's going to cost for the equipment. I knew like he had to come to town for the shoot. So there was Airbnb costs for him. And then I would just spend a lot of time Googling. It was wild. To get the grant, I was talking back and forth with David at Ohio Humanities. And at one point he was like, well, yeah, we want to see a script treatment. And I was like, script treatment? And I Googled how to write a documentary script treatment. And so like, it's great because I kind of just fumbled forward and learned a process. And now for my next film, I have a process. I just did it by making a film rather than learning how to make a film. I made the film and learned how to do it.
I love that you make this point because I'm really into podcasting, right? I love podcasting, like talking all the time. And it's really fascinating to me with podcasting or with creating video content or whatever, where people have all these ideas and we're like, well, why haven't you started? They're like, well, I need it to be this way. And I'm like crafting this and I'm like, it's like the perfection is killing you getting in front of a result. You do not need to do this perfectly. Like I am able to connect with sponsors and collaborators because I just got out of my way and got stuff done. It is not necessarily without fear. It's just, I'm more fearful of overthinking and then spending a year trying to make a decision. I don't want to do that. I just survived a pandemic, knock on wood. You know what I mean? Like I don't have time for all that decision making, like just decide and move forward. And I love that you made the film and you figured it out as you went along.
And I think you make a great point about the pandemic and just like, hey, we survived a pandemic. It has me thinking about the Great Resignation and how many people just figured out what was not working in their lives during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that was work or undignified work that they were like, I'm not taking this anymore. And I think that there's a big piece of that. Also, just during lockdown, you had some time to think about like what was really important. And I did all that too, right? And I was like, I am a creator and it's time for me to just finally work on what I wanted to work on. How long do we sit on a dream? Or how long do we sit on the stuff that we've always dreamed of doing? Now's the time. I wish I'd done it a decade ago, but I didn't. And now that I'm doing it, it's like a sweet spot. So I'm not complaining. It's just, it took me a minute to get there.
I feel like when we're in our businesses that we're always in the process of failing forward, if you will. I think that for some folks, it can feel very personal, like that they've actually failed versus this is a process of learning. I feel like maybe in this conversation, that's the sin that they're making is having too hard a judgment on the result. Instead of focusing on the process, they're really downing themselves on like, this is where I think I should be. But in order to get to point Z, you have to go through the whole alphabet to get to Z.
And I would say too, like, you don't really know what the full result of your work is. Like, you really have no idea how far your influence goes. And I think that's something too, that you might be fumbling along and feeling like you're not making any ground or any traction, or it doesn't look the way you thought it would look. And I think this is a really important point. If you take a moment to reflect on what you've done and where it has had an impact, that gives you a couple of things you can do. One, you can go where the energy is. If it's not having the result you thought it would, but it's having this other result, is that a direction for you to move? Two, you can just really, I think the reflection piece is key for a number of reasons. One, like integration purposes. moving forward purposes because you can be much more strategic. I understand why people take things personally like that. It's hard. It's really hard. Volume helps. Like if you're putting yourself out there, I mean, my inbox right now is a chaotic mess of acceptances and rejections. And it's almost like I have so much out there right now. Like I've applied to 29 film festivals. What was it yesterday? I think I got rejected for a film festival and I got an acceptance for, I got the money I asked for something. So it was just like, it was a wild ride. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe I got that. Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't get that. But it balances out. It's like, I don't take a lot of time to be like, oh my God, that's so disappointing. Like it's disappointing for about a day. And then the next day comes and the inbox is chaos again.
Actually, I want to go a little deeper on the amount that you're putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I've noticed in particular with people in the freelance space, whether it's freelance writing or copyright, whatever they're doing, when the money runs out or like when the projects dry up, it's usually because they're not putting themselves out there enough. And I would say that would be any aspect of building a digital brand. It's like you're just not out there enough. There's no system in place to get you out there consistently. And also there's no thought process around how to manage those moments when you get no. And I feel like you have to put yourself out there like daily, consistently, so that you can get the 5 yeses you need to really make a difference. So could you talk about what that looks like for you, for your business?
I mean, I think some of it is volume. When I mentioned to my co-director, David Bernabo, how many film festivals I was applying to, he was like, yeah, I get into about 10% of the ones that I've applied to. So I was like, all right, so I will apply for a whole bunch, right? Like if we get into 2, success. It only takes 1 to get the laurels. So, but I think too, like at first, especially like you don't have to be strategic and you don't have to have a system. You just have to put yourself out there. And that can look like responding to a bunch of tweets. And I mean, like organically and just, creating relationships, because I love Twitter. I have actual relationships with people on Twitter. I love that. But also there's a lot of weirdness around asking people for coffee sometimes, because you don't want to waste someone's time. You want to pay people to pick their brain, like their time is valuable, their knowledge is valuable. But sometimes it can be just as simple as like, hey, I really admire you and would love to have a cup of coffee with you. Or, hey, I think you're someone that I should know. I mean, that works too. Just don't be gross about it. And then also the old fashioned pitching. I mean, there's so many ways to put yourself out there. And that's, I think it can feel a lot like throwing spaghetti at the wall. And then you have like a wall full of spaghetti you've got to clean off later. But you don't have to be super strategic about it at first or have a system. The system will emerge from the wall of spaghetti.
I love that. For people who are worried about the mistakes that they make along the way, like in this journey of creating content, what's your piece of advice?
Oh my God, please make mistakes, because those are going to be great stories for your TED Talk later. If you're not making mistakes, you're not doing it right. Does that make sense? I mean, for all the grants that I did get, I did not get a lot of them. I just got a rejection yesterday that was heartbreaking. And I was like, oh, but okay, that's fine. It's not going to stop me. It was another like grant that really the partnership would have looked really good and it would have been really important. I didn't get it. That's okay. Keep going. Resilience.
I also think that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I feel like you're planting so many seeds that you're too busy to dwell on the disappointment.
There's a lot of that. Although the disappointment does come up in my morning pages a lot. Like, oh man, that would have been great. And I keep coming back to this too. And my friends remind me of this a lot. Like, well, if it didn't happen, it just wasn't the right one. The right one will find you. And I think that's important too. And that's a kind of like a faith issue that is really, I struggle with that. Like, no, but I wanted that one. And but that wasn't the one for you. And sometimes it means like you have to tweak the project or something wasn't right in your application. And maybe there's a lot of factors going into it. And I think that rejection can be helpful in those ways too. I especially am putting myself out there a lot right now. And that means it's just a numbers game. If you're out there a lot, you're going to get rejected a lot. That's why sometimes those games, like you've seen those like 100 rejection letter programs and things like that. Sometimes those are good just for the practice of it.
I have a question about designing a unique project for your brand. What was that like, just creating a documentary? What happened? How did that even happen?
How did it happen? Yeah. I mean, the part of the story that I love is that we were in lockdown and I just made friends with these guys on Twitter and they said yes to working with me. Like, what? Like the strangers I met on the internet? Like, and it was so fun. I said that on stage during the premiere. Like they were on stage with, or one of them was on stage with me. And I was like, thank you so much for taking this creative journey with this girl, your friend met on the internet. Like, it's so weird. But I think, I mean, I'm so grateful for David for taking that creative journey with me because I learned so much about the process and how, a lot of times, especially with the documentary filmmaking, we all think that we need crazy expensive equipment or, film school, that you can only make connections that way, et cetera, et cetera. And I am here to tell you, no, you do not. You have people in your network right now who can help you. You can do it on an iPhone now. There are so many tools out there. And I think that was it. Like, I don't want to be like anyone can be a filmmaker, but I kind of feel like anyone can be a filmmaker. I think it's more about having a unique story than anything. I mean, I think that's where the real production value lies, is in the story anyway. Putting it all together, it's been so interesting because also like in creating like your unique look and everything else, like, I knew exactly who I wanted to use for graphics, and Nick Sherman, he's in Portsmouth, and he had done these great graphics for the museum there that I had just been watching. And I was like, well, that's taken him. He's going to do the graphics. And he made that great logo, that Peerless City logo. He drew all the names, the titles in the film. And it looks spectacular. But to me, it feels very much like of the place because I found his work in the place. He works in the place. The story was personal to me. I've also been, let me just say this, like founding the nonprofit and then making this documentary, this has been decades in the making. It's a literary nonprofit. I did a lot of literary enrichment stuff in Portsmouth when I was a teenager. It's when I discovered the slogan for myself. And even one of these enrichment programs was at the museum, and it was with a poet, Diane Kendig, who a year after founding Cider Literary, I was at a different literary event in Youngstown, and I was at a table with her, and we were going around introducing ourselves. And when I was the last one to go, and I was like, yeah, when I was 16, I did a poetry workshop with Diane. And she's like, oh my God, you wrote the poem about the mosaic cross. And I don't know how she remembered that. But even then I was writing about Portsmouth. I had written a poem. I had found a mosaic cross at an antique store there. And I had compared it to the two streets where all the antique stores are, like the mosaics were the shops along the two cross streets. And it took a while to cook is what I'm saying. Like, if you've been sitting on an idea or something just seems like a one-day dream, like, but it still means something to you because the story, use it. Now is the time.
I think that's it. How can we support what you're doing and watch the documentary and like tell us all the things?
If you go to peerlesscity.com, you can watch the trailer. It's on YouTube. And, you can read, like, we're collecting all the press that we get for it there and future showings. Right now, I am exhausting screenings of the full length film, but we have PBS interest. And working on a PBS cut. Yeah, we had to.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
Right. We had to have that to get the big Ohio Humanities grant. So that was one of those, I had to dig deep into my network to find someone who could connect me because I was like, I don't know anyone. How do you even do this? Yeah, that was a big victory moment. It's when we got the letter. We will eventually have a PBS cut and it should be on PBS. But until then, I'm a one-woman distribution team right now. When I say I'm putting myself out there, I am like contacting historical societies and like local film groups and heritage museums and places. I think that at one point I would like to do some placemaking events because this film really is rooted in that. And I'm just reaching out and I don't have a number. I'm not doing like, I'll do 5 a day. It's just a lot of times it's like, oh, as soon as it occurs to me, I go to my computer and I send an email.
I think the lesson, like maybe the sin that you've avoided is inaction. There's a couple. You've avoided inaction, but you've also leaned into vision and not thinking yourself out of trusting yourself, which I think a lot of content creators do. They don't trust themselves, and they second guess their vision, and then nothing happens. I am so excited that you leaned into it, not knowing what that ride would be. And it's been a wild, I think, experience and result. And people, you need to watch the movie. Okay. You need to watch it and create your own. So with that being said, I say thank you. What's the next thing? What's the next project?
I got a book project in the works, and I've got another film on the horizon. I've written a couple grants, planning grants for that so far. So we'll see where that's where one of the rejections came from. And just, again, kind of like moving along. I got a couple events coming up with the nonprofit in September and October. Yeah, just leaning hard into that vision. It's funny, I get to be so much more strategic now because I've thrown so much spaghetti at the wall. I don't have to worry about some of it. Like, I'm really just doing what feeds the vision.
All right, people, you heard it. Get going. Feed the vision.